On a June morning in 1991, Carl Probin watched his stepdaughter walk toward the school bus stop, just a few dozen meters from their front door in Meyers, California. He turned back to his morning chores. Seconds later, a gray sedan pulled alongside her. A man got out, a stun gun in his hand. By the time Carl looked up, Jaycee Dugard was gone. He grabbed his bike and chased the car until it disappeared down the mountain road. For the next 18 years, that would be the last confirmed sighting anyone in South Lake Tahoe would have of an 11-year-old girl. What no one knew, not her mother, not the FBI, not the dozens of investigators who searched 2 states for her, was that Jaycee wasn't far away at all. She was less than 200 miles west, hidden behind a fence, in a backyard in Antioch, California. And for 18 years, the system meant to catch men like the one who took her walk past that fence more than 60 times. This is the story of how that happened, and how it finally ended, not because of a warrant or a wiretap, but because 2 ordinary people noticed something wrong and refused to look away. Meyers, California sits at 6,200 feet in the Sierra Nevada, 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe. It's a small community, home to roughly 5,000 people, ringed by ponderosa pine and the kind of quiet mountain roads where neighbors know each other's names and children ride bikes without much worry. It was, by every account from the people who lived there, an ordinary and safe place to raise a family. Terry Probin lived there with her husband, Carl Probin, and her daughter, Jaycee Dugard. Jaycee was 11 years old, blonde-haired, described by the people who knew her as cheerful, easy to laugh, the kind of kid who made an impression without trying to. She was nearing the end of the school year, that stretch of June when summer break is close enough that mornings feel lighter. Carl was her stepfather, and by 1991 the routine of getting Jaycee to the bus stop was just that, a routine, unremarkable, repeated hundreds of times before that morning. The stop was close, just a short walk from their front door, in a neighborhood where a walk like that wasn't something a parent thought twice about. That ordinariness matters, because nothing about Meyers, the Probin family, or that June morning gave any indication of what was about to happen. There was no warning, no unfamiliar car parked too long on the street, no reason for Carl to watch more closely than he always had. It was, until it wasn't, just another quiet town at the start of summer. June 10th, 1991 began like any other school day in the Probin household. It was late in the term, close enough to summer that the mornings carried that particular lightness kids get when the end of the year is finally in sight. Jaycee got ready for school the way she had countless mornings before. Nothing about the routine had changed. Nothing about the day gave any indication it would be different from the hundreds that came before it. Carl Probin drove Jaycee to the bus stop, just a few dozen meters from their front door. It was close enough that the drive itself was barely a drive at all, more a formality of the morning than a trip. He let her out at the stop, the same spot she waited at every school day, and turned back toward the house to get on with his morning chores. There was no reason to linger. This was a stop he'd dropped her at more times than he could count, in a neighborhood where an 11-year-old standing alone for a few minutes waiting for a bus wasn't a source of concern. Carl went back to the yard. Jaycee stood at the stop, waiting, the way she always did. That gap, the few minutes between a parent turning away and a bus arriving, is ordinary in almost every family's morning. It's built on the assumption that nothing happens in that window, an assumption every parent in Meyers shared, and one that had held true for Jaycee every school day of her life until that one. Within minutes, that assumption would be broken in a way that neither Carl Probin nor the rest of Meyers ever saw coming. Carl Probin was back in the yard, only a short distance from the bus stop, when he noticed a gray sedan slow down and pull up alongside Jaycee. He had no reason yet to think anything was wrong. Cars passed through the neighborhood every morning. What happened next took only seconds. A man got out of the car. He was later identified as Phillip Garrido, 40 years old, who had driven from Antioch, California, roughly 190 miles to the west, with his wife, Nancy Garrido, behind the wheel. Garrido used a stun gun on the 11-year-old girl standing at the stop, and in the same motion, pushed her into the vehicle. Carl saw it happen, the car stopping, the man getting out, his stepdaughter being forced inside, before he had time to fully process what he was watching. By the time it registered, the car was already pulling away. He ran for his bike and rode after it as hard as he could, chasing the vehicle down the road, trying to close a distance that was widening by the second. The car outran him. Within moments, it was gone, and Carl was left standing on an empty stretch of road that, a minute earlier, had been the same quiet street he'd dropped Jaycee off on 1,000 times before. There was no time to get a plate number. No time to make out more than a general description of the car and the man driving it. Other people in the area saw fragments of what happened too, but no single witness, including Carl, had enough detail to turn what they'd seen into something a police report could act on. Carl ran back to the house and called 911. In the space of what could not have been more than half a minute, an ordinary June morning in Meyers, California, had become the day Jaycee Dugard disappeared, and the last confirmed sighting anyone would have of her for 18 years. The call went out within minutes of Carl Probin dialing 911, and the response that followed became one of the largest search efforts in El Dorado County's history. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the state of California, and the FBI all launched investigations into Jaycee's disappearance almost immediately. Thousands of volunteers from across the South Lake Tahoe area joined the search. Search dogs worked the surrounding terrain. Helicopters covered ground on foot teams couldn't reach quickly. The FBI's Sacramento field office was brought in, and tips began arriving from across California and Nevada. Thousands of them. Each one logged, each one followed up on. Sightings were reported, checked, and ruled out. Leads were chased down and closed. None of them led back to Jaycee. Carl Probin had given investigators what he could, a description of the gray sedan and of the man who had used the stun gun. But there was no license plate, no distinguishing feature specific enough to narrow down a suspect. Not in a state with millions of gray cars on the road. It was the kind of description that was accurate but not actionable, true but not enough on its own to point anywhere. The investigation concentrated on South Lake Tahoe and the neighboring areas of Nevada, the logical radius for a case that began at a bus stop in the Sierra Nevada. What it never did, because nothing in the case pointed there, was extend toward the Bay Area, toward Contra Costa County, toward the city of Antioch, nearly 200 miles to the west, where Phillip Garrido lived and where Jaycee was already being held. Within weeks, the leads that had once poured in daily began to slow. The case did not close. It never officially would. But it grew colder with each month that passed, a search covering the wrong ground for a girl who was, the entire time, just a few hours' drive away. While El Dorado County searched the mountains around South Lake Tahoe, Phillip Garrido was back home in Antioch, living under a supervision system that already knew exactly what he was capable of. Garrido was a registered sex offender, on federal parole since 1988 for a crime he'd committed 15 years earlier. In 1976, he had kidnapped a woman named Catherine Calloway Hall in Nevada. He tied her up, held her in a shed, and sexually assaulted her for hours before he was caught. The sentence that followed was severe by design, 50 years in federal prison, plus a life sentence handed down in state court. It was meant to keep him out of society permanently. He served 11 years of it. Garrido was released in 1988, 3 years before he took Jaycee. During his parole, Catherine Hall did something few victims in her position do. She went back to the system herself, contacting Garrido's parole agent directly to warn that he was continuing dangerous behavior and needed closer supervision. She was the person who understood, better than anyone, exactly what he was capable of, and she used that knowledge to try to stop it from happening again. The warning did not change how closely Garrido was supervised. 3 years later, Jaycee Dugard was standing at a bus stop in Meyers, California, roughly 190 miles from where Garrido lived. Far enough that nothing in the investigation into her disappearance had any reason to connect a registered sex offender in Antioch to a gray car in the Sierra Nevada. Not because the connection was impossible to see, because no one was looking in that direction at all. Jaycee was taken to 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, California, a suburban property where neighbors saw only what the front house showed them. A family. Nothing unusual, nothing to prompt a second look. Behind that house, hidden by dense trees, a tall fence, and tarps positioned to block any view from outside, Phillip Garrido had built and continued to expand a hidden compound of tents and sheds, roughly 900 square feet in total. It was there, out of sight of the street, the neighbors, and eventually the parole officers assigned to watch him, that Jaycee was held. In the earliest years of her captivity, her isolation was near total. She had no contact with anyone outside the property except Phillip and Nancy Garrido. There was no school, no medical care, and for long stretches, no reliable electricity or running water. She was 11 years old when she arrived, cut off entirely from the community, the family, and the life she'd had in Meyers. Garrido raped her repeatedly, beginning at the time of her abduction and continuing throughout her years in captivity, while his parole file continued to describe him as compliant with the conditions of his release. In 1994, when Jaycee was 14, she gave birth to her first daughter at the property without a doctor, a hospital, or any medical support. In 1997, at 17, she gave birth to a second daughter under the same conditions. Both girls grew up inside the compound. No school, no birth certificates, no record of their existence anywhere in the outside world. To anyone who asked, Garrido described them as his granddaughters. Garrido maintained control over Jaycee not through physical confinement alone, but through years of psychological manipulation, isolation from any outside perspective, complete dependence on him for survival, and a self-styled religious framework in which he cast himself as a prophet on a divine mission. Inside the compound, that worldview became the only reality Jaycee and her daughters had access to. In her memoir, A Stolen Life, Jaycee later wrote about what that isolation did, how it reshaped what seemed possible, and why escape was never as simple as it might look from the outside. She wrote about the moment everything changed for her, the birth of her first daughter, which gave her, for the first time since her abduction, someone else to live for, and a reason to keep going that had nothing to do with herself. While Jaycee and her two daughters lived behind the fence at 1554 Walnut Avenue, Phillip Garrido remained, on paper, a supervised parolee. Between 1999 and 2009, his parole officers conducted 60 separate checks at the property. Each visit followed roughly the same pattern. An officer would arrive, knock on the front door, speak with Garrido there, note in the file that he was in compliance with the terms of his parole, and leave. 60 times over 10 years, that was the extent of it. Not once, in any of those 60 visits, did a parole officer walk into the backyard. A full property inspection is a basic requirement when supervising a registered sex offender, and Garrido's file gave officers every reason to take that requirement seriously. A prior kidnapping conviction, a victim who had personally warned that he remained dangerous, and now years of unexplained activity on a property large enough to hide far more than a conversation at the front door could reveal. None of that changed how the checks were carried out. Jaycee and her daughters lived just a few meters from where those parole officers stood during each visit, separated only by a fence and the tarps Garrido had put up to block the view. 60 times, supervision came to the property whose entire purpose was to monitor a man the system already knew was capable of exactly this. And 60 times, it left having seen only what Garrido allowed it to see. The parole checks weren't the only chance the system had to find Jaycee. Twice more, information reached the people responsible for watching Phillip Garrido, and twice more, nothing changed. In 2006, 15 years into Jaycee's captivity, a neighbor contacted the Antioch Police Department directly. The neighbor reported that people appeared to be living in tents in Garrido's backyard, and that children's voices could be heard coming from the covered area behind the house. This wasn't a vague suspicion passed along secondhand. It was a specific, first-hand report from someone close enough to see tents and hear children, the kind of detail law enforcement is trained to take seriously. Officers went to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They spoke with Garrido at the front of the property. They did not go into the backyard. They left, and the report filed afterward noted no issues at the address. Jaycee, her two daughters, and 15 years of evidence of what had happened to them remained behind the gate the officers had stood in front of before turning around and leaving. 2 years later, in 2008, California's parole agency opened its own review of Garrido after receiving information about unusual behavior. Investigators returned to the property, questioned him about his activities, and once again, no one checked the backyard. The compound stayed exactly as hidden as it had been for the 17 years before it. 2 separate reports, 2 years apart, from 2 different sources, a neighbor and a state agency's own investigators, both arriving at the same address, and both ending the same way. A conversation at the front door, and a report that found nothing wrong. On August 24, 2009, Phillip Garrido came to the University of California, Berkeley campus with 2 teenage girls, his biological daughters with Jaycee, to request a permit for a religious event tied to a group he called God's Desire. Jaycee was not with him. She was still at the property in Antioch. The first person to meet with him was Lisa Campbell, manager of the UCPD events office, responsible for issuing campus event permits. Campbell noticed almost immediately that something about the situation was wrong. Garrido's manner was intense and erratic. The way he described his religious mission carried an unstable edge, and the two girls with him seemed withdrawn and submissive in a way that struck her as out of place. Campbell didn't confront him. Instead, she scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next day and reported what she'd observed to Officer Allied Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department. Jacobs ran a background check on Garrido through dispatch and found what his file already contained: a registered sex offender, on federal parole since 1976 for kidnapping and rape. That alone was enough to raise serious concern. A registered offender with that history, appearing on a university campus with two girls he called his daughters, at a time when his own parole file had no record that he had any children at all. The next day, August 25th, Jacobs and Campbell met with Garrido again, keeping the conversation ordinary so as not to alert him that he was being investigated. The goal was to avoid giving him any reason to disappear before parole authorities could act. During that meeting, Garrido opened a bag and showed them a self-published book he had written about schizophrenia. After the meeting, Jacobs contacted Garrido's parole officer, Edward Santos Jr., directly. She told him about the two girls, about Garrido's behavior over the 2 days, and about everything she and Campbell had observed. Santos recognized it immediately as information that didn't match anything in Garrido's file, and summoned him to the parole office in Concord, instructing him to bring everyone with him. 2 campus employees, with no forensic evidence and no warrant, had done in 2 days what 60 parole checks and 2 separate police reports had failed to do in 18 years. They noticed that something was wrong, and they didn't let it go. On August 26, 2009, Phillip Garrido arrived at the parole office in Concord, California, exactly as instructed, bringing with him Nancy Garrido, the 2 teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced to investigators as his niece, Alyssa. Investigators separated each of them for individual questioning. Under interrogation, Garrido eventually admitted that he had kidnapped and raped Jaycee Dugard in 1991. In a separate room, the young woman who had spent 18 years living under the name Alyssa in the compound behind the Antioch property confirmed her real identity. The 11-year-old girl who had vanished from a bus stop in Meyers, whose stepfather had chased her kidnapper's car on a bicycle and lost it on the road, was now a 29-year-old woman, saying her real name to authorities for the first time in 18 years. That night, Jaycee and her 2 daughters were taken to a safe location, away from the property that had been the entirety of their world for nearly 2 decades. The FBI arranged a phone call between Jaycee and her mother, Terry Probin, who was in Southern California at the time, the first time either of them had heard the other's voice in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The next morning, Terry flew north and was reunited with her daughter, along with 2 granddaughters she had never known existed. Phillip and Nancy Garrido were arrested that same day, August 26, 2009, after Garrido's confession. The initial charges were extensive: kidnapping, false imprisonment, multiple counts of rape, including rape in concert with kidnapping, and lewd acts with a minor under 14, among others. Both initially pleaded not guilty, and the case moved through nearly 2 years of hearings and delays, with prosecutors in El Dorado County working to resolve it without requiring Jaycee or her daughters to testify. In April 2011, Phillip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault, including 6 counts of rape and 7 counts of lewd acts. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible rape under California's one-strike law. Both waived their right to appeal as part of the agreement, which was structured in part to spare Jaycee and her daughters from testifying in open court. At sentencing in June 2011, at the El Dorado County Superior Court in Placerville, Jaycee was not present. Her written statement was read aloud in the courtroom by her mother, Terry Probin. Judge Douglas C. Feaster called Phillip Garrido the poster child for what a sexual predator is, and sentenced him to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life, the maximum sentence available under the laws in effect in 1991 when the crimes were first committed. Afterward, Jaycee brought a lawsuit against the state of California over the years of failed parole supervision that had allowed her captivity to continue undetected. The state settled for $20 million, the largest settlement in California's history for a parole system failure, and a formal acknowledgement that what happened to Jaycee Dugard was not only the crime of two people, but the failure of a system that had every opportunity to stop it and didn't. In the years following her rescue, Jaycee Dugard did more than survive. People close to her recovery, including her former therapist, described her to the press as living remarkably well, someone who had built a genuine, functioning life out of what had been taken from her, and who had every reason to be proud of how far she'd come. In 2011, she published A Stolen Life, a memoir recounting her 18 years in captivity. The book became a bestseller and was widely regarded as one of the most honest survivor accounts ever written, not because it dwelled on the worst of what happened to her, but because it told the truth about what it actually takes to survive something like that. The psychology of it, the impossible calculations, the reasons escape was never as simple as it looks from the outside. It's a story only she could tell accurately, because she was the only one who lived it. She went on to found the Jaycee Foundation, an organization that supports families and victims of abduction, with a particular focus on helping them reintegrate and recover in ways that standard medical and legal systems aren't built to fully address. It took the 18 years that were taken from her and turned them into something that could help other families going through their own versions of the same nightmare, a choice that was entirely hers to make, and one nobody had the right to ask of her. Her case leaves behind 3 lessons that matter well beyond her own story. The first is about what happens when warnings from victims are dismissed. Catherine Hall told Garrido's parole agent, in plain terms, that he remained dangerous. That warning was set aside. 3 years later, Garrido kidnapped an 11-year-old girl. Systems built to manage known offenders have to weigh a victim's warning as seriously as any other piece of evidence in the file, because sometimes it's the only piece of evidence that matters. The second is about what a check is actually supposed to mean. 60 visits to the same property over 10 years, and not one of them included a look at the space behind the house. A parole check on a convicted kidnapper isn't a formality to be completed at the front door. It has to mean an actual inspection of the property, every time, without exception. The third is about what Lisa Campbell and Officer Ally Jacobs did with nothing more than a feeling that something wasn't right. They had no warrant, no forensic evidence, no tip from a database. They had 2 people who seemed out of place, and they chose not to look away from it. That instinct, a person who looks afraid, a stranger with too much control over the people around them, a situation that doesn't sit right, is worth acting on. Reporting it doesn't require certainty. It only requires refusing to ignore it. Jaycee Dugard was 11 years old when she disappeared from a bus stop in Meyers, California. She was found, 18 years later, less than 200 miles from home, not because the system finally worked, but because 2 people who weren't even looking for her noticed something wrong and said so.